Up next is Christina Gish. She's joining us today from Iowa State University, where she's an associate professor in the Department of World Languages and Cultures. Christina combines oral history, ethnography, and archival research to explore the mechanisms Indigenous people use to assert their sovereign relationship with their historical landscape, despite the ruptures created by removal, reservations, assimilation, and development. In her research, kinship networks that connect both human and non human entities to landscape emerge as one important mechanism that Native peoples have historically used to assert both cultural identity and political sovereignty in many spheres, including negotiation of political relationships with the United States, resistance to removal from the homelands, establishment of reservation boundaries, maintenance of cultural landscapes, and preservation of food systems. Her most recent research on Indigenous food sovereignty explores the ways that Indigenous corn agriculture, seed development, and broader food systems have acted as important mechanisms that Native people have used to assert both cultural identity and political autonomy. Thank you, Christina, for joining us. Take it away.
Hi, thank you. Now that intro feels long. Let's see. Let me start sharing my screen. And okay, and you all can see the all right, wonderful.
It looks like we're
Um,
actually in your speaker notes, so it looks like it's
oh shoot,
reversed.
how about that?
That's
Is
good.
that
Yeah,
better?
yeah.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so my talk today is entitled They Live Such a Good Life, Seeds as Babies, Seeds as Ancestors. And I would like to just open by taking a moment to acknowledge my presence as a guest on Indigenous land. So I'm a non-Native person working with Native communities in the region where I live. And for generations, Iowa, Meskwaki, Sauk, Dakota, and Oto peoples, among others, have stewarded the lands here in Iowa, where I'm speaking to you from. Also, I think as faculty at Iowa State, I think it's important to note that the land is located on the ancestral lands and territory of the Bakotse or Iowa Nation. And the reason that I like to bring this up is because I think it's really useful to just take a moment to recognize the obligations that we have to the land that we live on, even when we're guests, and to the Indigenous people who care for it. And so I feel this is a first step towards responsible research, but we have to continue that. And there are ways to do that, working collaboratively with Indigenous people towards knowledge production that's useful and respectful. And so the materials that I'm going to share with you today are just a small part of this collaborative research that I've been conducting with Indigenous folks in the area where I live. So Oneida people in Wisconsin, Ho-Chunk people both in Wisconsin and Nebraska, Omaha folks in Nebraska, Santee folks also in Nebraska. And it's just a great honor to be learning from Indigenous seed keepers. I'm really humbled to be able to share some of those insights with you all today. Okay, so I just want to begin with just a quick discussion of Indigenous food sovereignty. And just to kind of put the definition out there as I use it and other folks as well, right? So the ability to determine culturally appropriate foodways free from outside interference. And I think it's really important to note that this includes more than just food, right? It includes access to land, to seeds, seed selection, culturally appropriate seeds, indigenous seeds, production techniques, harvesting, processing, and then of course, food preparation, how food is prepared. And seeds are really essential to these goals, right? Seeds are foundational to the goal of food sovereignty. So let's talk a little bit about, I just want to talk a little bit about what does that mean for seeds to be foundational, and what does that relationship look like between people and seeds, right? And why is it just so primary to Indigenous food sovereignty, particularly for agricultural peoples, right? So seeds as kin. Vine Deloria states human beings as the youngest creatures look to non-human or other than human kin for guidance on how to live and fulfill their responsibilities. to one another and the earth. And we heard that really clearly from Dr. Kimmerer's talk as well, right? So as the youngest folks here, as the last ones to arrive, right, we need to look to other than human kin for guidance. And that belief system becomes incredibly important in indigenous agriculture, in native agriculture, where the relationship created between seeds and humans is one of nurturing, guidance, protection, and it's akin to the relationship between ancestors and their descendants. So for native, oh, and so then I wanted to share with you a beautiful quote from Jessica Greendeer, who's a Ho-Chunk seed keeper that I've been working with. And she says, for native people, even some non-native people, we don't look at the seed as an object or a thing. They're a living being, they give life, and they get adopted into communities. They become relatives of those particular people that carry them and care for them. So thinking about seeds as kin is actually really multifaceted. And so when you start talking to Indigenous folks about these ideas of seeds and kit as kin, you see all different, you see multiple perspectives and kind of relationships at play. So one is seeds as babies. And often the plant is thought of as the mother, although not always, right? Sometimes father or grandfather or grandmother, other kinds of relative relationships. But seeds are often thought of as infants. And so I have, again, some beautiful quotes that I want to share with you. And the first is from Buffalo Bird Woman, who was a Hidatsa grower, and she was born in 1839. So she's speaking, this quote comes from the early turn of the 20th century. And she says, we cared for our corn in those days, and she's talking about before the reservation was established, as we would care for a child. For we Indian people loved our gardens, just as a mother loves her children. We thought that our growing corn liked to hear us sing, just as children like to hear their mother sing to them. And a lot of the seed keepers that I work with continue to sing in their gardens and sing to the plants that they are nurturing and that nurture them. And in fact, there are specific songs to be sung, but I've also heard from people that like plants love music, right? And it's just really beautiful. And so from Becky Webster, who's an Oneida seed keeper, she shared, we think our seeds are women and they're female. They carry life. They're going to be bringing life into this world, right? And so, um, life-giving, right? And then again, Jessica Greendeer, there are so many different cultural teachings about the seeds being feminine or being women. Women have a different way of looking at things than our male counterparts do. Not only are you being a good mother to your seeds, right? So seeds as infants, right? But women have the gift of giving life. That's exactly what seeds do. That's their whole purpose. They sacrifice themselves for the future or for their future generations. It's all about the feminine energy surrounding it, right? So multifaceted, seeds as infants, but also seeds as mothers, right? And the grower as a mother as well, right? Notice that. Okay, so another facet is this idea of seeds as ancestors. And Dr. Kimmer spoke really beautifully about this in her keynote address. But some of the things that have been shared with me are the ideas that seeds holds knowledge and legacy of human ancestors who have interacted with them like for generations, right? For hundreds upon hundreds of years. And through these relationships, seeds act as ancestors to those who steward them because of the wisdom and knowledge that they contain, right? So think about, all that wisdom that's held in a seed. What is that, what does that look like, right? And it looks like so many things. They have the ability to pass on their information from one generation to the next. What kind of information, right? Nutritional information, the kinds of proteins and, starches and minerals and vitamins that they pass on. They have the ability to adapt to their environments. I mean, quite incredibly, right? And even to their participation in cultural ceremonies and stories, right? And so their ability to pass on to the next generation is just vast, right? Um, so seeds are valued as keepers of cultural knowledge and memories. Their depth of wisdom and their generosity in sharing resources so prolifically elevates seeds to the position of a cherished ancestor, right? They're so generous. They give so much, right? Um, and Becky Webster again says, the seeds are our memory. They're keeping our identity generation after generation. Really beautiful. So I want to just spend just a minute talking a little bit about seed sovereignty under threat. And I'm happy to expand on this. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly to get back to the kin relationships, but I'm happy to expand on this. This is another component of my research. So, please let me know if you have questions. But there are a lot of reasons that seed sovereignty has been under threat since contact with Europeans, certainly theft of indigenous seeds, land loss, right? Not having access to places to grow, and then, of course, assimilation policies. And so just a couple quick examples here. Farming programs for students. So in both Canada and the United States, Indigenous students were removed from their families and homes and taken to boarding schools, residential schools. And in those places were taught Euro-American styles of agriculture. They were also taught Euro-American styles of eating. And I mean, this is something I hadn't thought much about when I got into this work, but of course that shifts your palate from an indigenous diet to one that is full of salt and fat and sugar, which is, can be quite a challenge, right? And then also back home, certainly in the United States, Indian agents, folks from the federal government are coming in and enforcing Euro-American style agriculture, encouraging people to grow commodity crops like potatoes and onions that sometimes people aren't even interested in eating, while at the same time, uh, uh, using indigenous seeds to bolster a Western capitalist economy. And again, I'm happy to speak more about this. A lot of seeds, a lot of indigenous bred seeds were taken by non-native seed producers because of their just incredible qualities, right? And are, still out there today in the marketplace. But again, happy to answer more questions about that in the Q&A. Um, okay, so what do we, what kinds of responses can we have to these threats to seed sovereignty? And what are Native nations doing to kind of change those dynamics, repair and heal from those ruptures? So one really important component is rematriation, which is bringing indigenous seeds home from institutions where they're kept still today. And so Becky Webster has a beautiful quote talking about what that means for kin relationships. And she says, I think it is reestablishing that relationship with seeds because we consider our seeds relatives. So we want to bring them home so that we can care for them and they can care for us. So we can nurture that reciprocal relationship that we had in the past because so often we've lost contact with those relatives. And actually, some of the other folks that I worked with talked about welcoming seeds home as welcoming home children who had been taken from the community forcibly and, thought about talked about how powerful that is to be able to welcome those relatives home. Okay, so then what does that mean? This whole process of reestablishing those relationships of relatedness, what is through Indigenous agriculture, right? And what does that mean for increasing resiliency and for just the wider ecosystem? Incredibly, incredibly powerful things going on there. So it really gets us thinking about rearranging the relationships that people have with each other other than human relatives, right? So if we start thinking of plants and seeds as relatives, then we can't think of them as commodities, right? And Dr. Kimmer talked a lot about this. We can't think of them as it, we think of them as them, we think of them as she or he. They're our relatives. They care for us, we care for them. So it really gets us to reorder those relationships and helps us shift to a kin-centric worldview, which gets us thinking about treating others with reciprocal respect. And the reason I have the raccoon and the cranes here is because a lot of people spoke to me about one challenge they had as growers, shifting their thinking from raccoons and deer and cranes as pests, right? And acknowledging them again as relatives who are also hungry for their traditional foods, which I'd like, that was so powerful to me. So how do we grow and, maintain that relatedness, right? That kin-centric worldview. And there are just all kinds of uh, aspects here that, help to repair the ecosystem in really powerful ways. So one is that relationship between people and our food, right? And so processing these foods, processing these seeds, growing them, and then processing them for food really helps people develop a very different relationship between people and food than, going to the grocery store, thinking of food as commodity, something you just pick up and buy. So, for example, seeds are always passing through human hands in this system, right? And in a lot of industrialized systems, seeds they rarely pass through human hands. They may never pass through human hands, right? So then that relationship is like really severed, right? And then this process, right, connects growers to eaters, growers and eaters, connects them together, and then connects them to their ancestors. And through this process, Native nations can enact indigenous knowledge systems, right? So growing, processing, and eating indigenous foods then can be healing to the body and spirit. And again, that's something I'm happy to talk more about, but the narratives that people's experiences that they have shared with me about how profoundly healing this process is are incredible. I mean, to the point where people have gotten off of medication through, these processes. It's really, really powerful. Okay, so reflections on repatriating seed, relatives, and resiliency, right? So the resiliency of the community, health of mind, body, and spirit of a person and a community, but then also wider ecosystem, right? So pursuing indigenous food sovereignty can be a really powerful way to remain resilient in the face of climate change. As Dr. Kimmer pointed out, our plant relatives, have a pretty powerful understanding of how to respond to climate change. And part of that process can be conserving seeds, right? So indigenous seeds, these rare seeds that are threatened by creating seed libraries and seed swaps and supporting seed stewards in indigenous communities, stewarding healthy foods through things like tribal farms, all the kinds of activities that Jason was talking about through farmers markets, elders boxes, um, and then renewing ecosystems, right? So, wetlands, woodlands, prairies, food forests, right? Bringing buffalo back to the prairie, powerful stuff. Restoring clean waters when you minimize pollutants and you minimize inputs into your growing system, you restore your clean water and you maintain a nutritious diet. And then this can build strong community networks through workshops and collective labor and trade. Okay, so I think my sense is that we have an audience of folks, of both Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks, people across a wide range of connections to agriculture. And so one thing I wanted to speak on for just a minute, as a non-Native person who has been collaborating with Native nations for quite some time, are just a few things about what that requires. And again, happy to speak more on this in the Q&A, but listening is very, very important. And I'm going to say more on that in a minute. Respectful reciprocity. So just like plants, just like people and other than human relatives need to be in a respectful, reciprocal relationship. Non-native institutions need to also be in respectful, reciprocal relationships with indigenous knowledge holders. And part of that reciprocity is about supporting and upholding indigenous knowledge systems through the work that we do. And then with the goal of building networks for sharing, right? So I really love Tayaki Alfred's quote when he argues that listening is really essential to the process of decolonizing Native relationships with their landscapes. And he states that if non-Native people are willing to listen, and I think, really listen deeply, right? Don't talk, listen, even though I'm talking a lot right now. They'll discover, quote, an alternative to the settler society by inviting them to share our vision of respect and peaceful coexistence, end quote. And I just think as a result, we're stronger together. It's really powerful. So thank you. Really appreciate your time.
Miigwech, thank you, Christina. That was wonderful. Again, a reminder to put all your questions for Christina in the Q&A, and we'll have a Q&A session following up the presentation by Jill, who I'd like to introduce right now.